In 1461, 22 nuns vanished after their convent burned, but the empire didn't record them as missing women. It recorded them as assets. In the Ottoman imperial ledger, each nun was listed beside barrels of grain and bolts of silk, valued at 40 silver coins. Faith had become a line item in the empire's book of profit. Who paid that price? The chronicles are silent, but under Topkapı Palace, the bones still whisper. If you care about truth over legend, subscribe. Because when the ledgers close, bones still speak. Autumn. The highlands of Thessaly were thick with the scent of smoke and olive wood. The convent of St. Catherine, a quiet stone refuge that had stood for 147 years, was on fire. Its bells, once rung for prayer, clanged wildly in the heat before falling silent. 22 Benedictine nuns stood barefoot on the courtyard's cracked stones, surrounded by soldiers whose armor gleamed orange from the flames. At the front was their abbess, Sister Elani of Larissa. Her face was streaked with ash, her voice steady. "Keep your vows inside your hearts," she told them. "They cannot take that." But she was wrong. The men who came weren't here to steal relics or burn books. They were here to erase the meaning behind them. 8 years had passed since Sultan Mehmed II conquered Constantinople. Now his armies swept across Greece like a living tide, absorbing every monastery and chapel left from the fallen Byzantine world. It wasn't destruction, it was conversion. Every church turned mosque, every priest turned captive, every act of faith rewritten as proof of the Sultan's divine order. At precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the first cannonball struck the convent wall. Stones cracked, frescoes shattered, and the wind carried fragments of Latin hymns into the smoke. By sunset, the gates collapsed. Soldiers poured in, not the disciplined janissaries of Istanbul, but rough provincial troops hungry for reward and reputation. Their commander, Mehmet Bey, held orders written in elegant Arabic script. Take religious figures alive for questioning and re-education. But the fire spread faster than obedience. The chapel roof fell first. Sparks rained like burning snow. The silver crucifix from Rome, the one the sisters had kissed every morning, was ripped from the altar and tossed into a sack with candlesticks and jewelry. The nuns were forced to their knees, hands bound. Sister Magdalena, only 17, clutched her prayer beads so tightly the wood split beneath her fingers. By nightfall, the convent was gone, but the empire did not forget them. 3 days later, an Ottoman clerk made a brief entry in a military register. 22 female prisoners, religious order, destination, Constantinople, for imperial disposition. No mention of names, no mention of vows, only quantity, cargo, and value. That was how the empire measured faith, in units of obedience, recorded in ink. And for the 22 women who disappeared that autumn, the long road to the heart of the empire had just begun. The Ottoman convoy left Thessaly 3 days after the flames died. The air still smelled of burnt olive wood, of ash and prayer smoke. The soldiers, provincial men hardened by war and boredom, led the 22 nuns down the mountain path in silence. Their wrists were bound with coarse rope, their ankles hobbled just enough to prevent running. No one spoke, not the captors, not the captives. Only the creak of leather and the distant ringing of mule bells echoed across the valley. The order was clear. transport to Constantinople for imperial disposition. Those 4 words, stamped in a clerk's ledger, turned the nuns into administrative objects. They were no longer women of God, they were evidence of conquest. For the Ottoman system, faith itself was a resource. Every new conquest required proof that Allah's dominion had expanded. Churches turned to mosques, crosses melted into coins, believers remade into citizens of the Sultan. The body was merely the tool. What mattered was compliance. On the 3rd day of the march, Sister Magdalena collapsed. The soldiers didn't strike her. They waited. Her sisters lifted her, murmuring psalms under their breath. That moment of small mercy, of being allowed to help, cut deeper than cruelty. It whispered that obedience might be rewarded, that the empire could be reasoned with. That illusion was the real weapon. By the 7th day, they reached the port of Volos. The docks were lined with wooden crates marked for Alexandria, Tunis, and Istanbul. The nuns were marched directly onto a galley, their names replaced with numbers on a manifest. Religious prisoners, 22, for palace evaluation. Between crates of spices and sacks of wheat, they were chained to benches below deck. The voyage across the Aegean began at dusk. Down in the hold, it was never dark enough to rest. The air reeked of pitch, sweat, and brine. Chains rubbed skin raw. Above them, sailors sang work songs, loud, rhythmic, utterly indifferent. The sisters prayed quietly, each word trembling through exhaustion. On the 4th night, when a storm battered the ship, Sister Magdalena began to sing the Agnus Dei through chapped lips. One by one, the others joined her. Their voices, thin as threads, wove through the thunder. Yusuf R., the ship's overseer, would later write in his memoir, "Even the sailors paused. Some crossed themselves in secret, others whispered our own prayers. For a moment, the ship felt divided not by faith, but by suffering. When the storm cleared, the sea was red with dawnlight. The women, starved, soaked, trembling, sang no more. Their song had outlasted the storm, but not the exhaustion. 12 days later, the galley entered the Bosphorus. Before them rose the city they had only heard of in sermons, Constantinople, its walls scarred but standing, domes shining like armor in the sunrise. Hagia Sophia dominated the skyline, once the heart of Christendom, now crowned with a crescent. The nuns were paraded through the streets from the docks to the imperial district. People stopped to watch. Christians bowed their heads. Muslims looked on in silence. The procession wasn't punishment. It was theater. The empire knew the value of spectacle. Faith must not only be conquered, it must be seen conquered. The women were made to kneel before the great gates of Topkapı Palace. The call to prayer echoed from minarets that had once held bells. Sister Theodora, the eldest, whispered, "We are home, but it is no longer ours." Inside the palace, the Grand Vizier waited in a marble hall, a man whose expression had been trained into neutrality. The 22 were brought before him. Through interpreters, he read the Sultan's decree. Those who renounce the false god shall be granted mercy. Those who persist in error shall receive the discipline of faith. The scribes at his side dipped their pens in ink, ready to record either salvation or defiance. None of the women spoke. Their silence became its own declaration. Sister Elani stepped forward. Her voice cracked, but she faced him without flinching. "You may change our names. You may take our prayers. But what is carved into the soul cannot be rewritten." The interpreter hesitated. The vizier did not. "Then you will learn the weight of your own silence." With a gesture, he consigned them to the palace's lower chambers, neither executed nor freed, placed instead in the space between existence and disappearance. That bureaucratic cruelty was deliberate. Death ended rebellion. Silence prolonged it. The descent beneath Topkapı was literal. Down narrow steps, past iron doors and oil lamps, the air grew heavy and damp. These were the unseen halls, where valuable captives waited for ransom, negotiation, or erasure. The nuns were stripped of their habits and given rough linen robes. Their hair was cut short. Each was assigned a number burned onto a wooden tag tied around the wrist. They were not called by name again. Their work began at dawn, scrubbing marble floors, washing linens for the upper palace, hauling firewood for rooms they would never enter. Every gesture of servitude was meant to remind them that they had lost control over their bodies, and, eventually, over their faith. But the Ottomans misjudged their enemy. These women had already renounced wealth, comfort, and even identity when they took their vows. Poverty was not punishment, it was familiar, and obedience, stripped of meaning, became resistance. At night, when the guards dozed, they whispered fragments of prayer, not aloud, but through rhythm, touch, and memory. One would trace a cross on the floor, another would finish the pattern with her palm. Faith became a code, a secret network of gestures passed from one soul to another. Months later, an Ottoman clerk inspecting the lower quarters wrote a note in the margin of his log. The Christian captives do not respond to correction. They remain docile but unassimilated. In the language of empire, that meant failure. You can conquer land, burn temples, melt relics, but not teach the heart to forget its shape. And somewhere below the palace gardens, in a narrow stone chamber lit by a single candle, Sister Magdalena whispered to the others, "If they wish to erase us, then let our silence become our mark." It was the beginning of something the empire could not record, faith turning into defiance, captivity into covenant. What began as an act of surrender was quietly becoming a war of endurance. Below Topkapı Palace, where sunlight never reached, the empire stored its unfinished stories. The corridors were narrow, carved from damp stone that smelled of rust and sweat. Water dripped constantly, echoing like slow time. This was where things that embarrassed the state were hidden. Rebellious governors, disobedient scholars, and now, 22 women whose existence complicated victory. They were lodged in a long, windowless chamber with a single oil lamp chained to the wall. A guard counted them aloud each morning as though inventorying livestock. To the Ottoman bureaucracy, they were inventory, each assigned a wooden tag with a number. Their names were struck from record. Officially, they had ceased to exist. But a strange reversal began almost immediately. In erasing them, the empire had freed them from the world's gaze. And in that darkness, something forbidden began to take shape. Community without hierarchy, prayer without permission. Their daily routine was designed to break will through exhaustion. At dawn, they scrubbed marble floors in the upper corridors where viziers once walked. At noon, they washed linens for the Sultan's wives, always under guard. At dusk, they hauled wood to feed the palace furnaces. Silence was mandatory. Speech without authorization was punished by starvation. Yet, silence, to these women, was familiar terrain. They had taken vows of it long before captivity. What was meant as deprivation became discipline reborn. Sister Magdalena, once the youngest, now hardened by hunger, noticed something peculiar. In the palace kitchens, the servants sang work songs to keep rhythm. So did the soldiers. But here, below the empire's heart, sound was forbidden. That prohibition itself became a language. Each night, when the guards retreated to the stairwell, the sisters gathered around the faint lamp. Without words, they rebuilt fragments of scripture from memory, each recalling a verse, another completing it, weaving meaning out of silence. They used stones to mark prayers on the floor, fingers to trace invisible crosses into the air. It was a ritual without witness, faith as memory rather than speech. Weeks passed, skin thinned, eyes hollowed, yet something defiant shimmered beneath the fatigue. One evening, Sister Theodora whispered that she had found a hollow behind the wall, an old, sealed archway buried under debris. It took them nights of scraping with bare fingers to clear it. Behind lay a forgotten storage chamber, barely large enough to stand upright. They claimed it as their own. There, under broken pottery and dust, they made a chapel. A shard of mirror became a crucifix, a torn scrap of linen, an altar cloth. From the wax of fallen candles, they molded crude shapes of light. In this room, hidden from empire and scripture alike, they prayed, not aloud, but with breath and rhythm. Sister Elani called it the room God forgot to surrender. Faith, stripped of its symbols, had found its purest form. It no longer needed church bells or Latin. It lived in rhythm, repetition, and the stubborn refusal to die quietly. Months later, word spread through the palace that the Christian captives do not despair. Guards joked that the ghosts below were praying with no priest. The rumor irritated officials. Mercy, they said, had failed. So new orders came down, re-education by kindness. The next morning, the guards opened the doors and brought trays of warm food, bread, olives, clean water. The women stared at it in disbelief. They were given soap, fresh clothes, even blankets. For the first time in months, they slept without shivering. Then on the visitors, learned imams, chosen for gentleness and eloquence, arrived to converse. Through translators, they spoke not of threats, but understanding. "Your God and ours are not so different," said one scholar. Both ask for surrender. Both promise paradise. You may keep your heart, only your words must change. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, not torture, but temptation. To make faith appear negotiable, to turn conviction into a trade of semantics. Sister Theodora listened patiently. Then she asked, "If words don't matter, why do you want them so badly?" The scholar had no answer. The next day, the food stopped coming. The empire reverted to its old logic. Deprivation. The lamps were taken. The air grew colder. One by one, women vanished, removed for questioning, never returned. The remaining sisters didn't weep. They simply knelt in the darkness of their hidden chapel and continued their silent mass. The fewer they became, the stronger the echo of their presence seemed to grow. Even the guards began to avoid the corridor. Some claimed the air felt heavy, that voices whispered Latin in the walls. Others said the smell of candle wax lingered though no candles burned. In June 1462, an Ottoman administrator wrote in the margins of his report, "The captives below remain unresponsive, unsuitable for re-education. Recommend disposal." That word, disposal, appeared again and again in imperial documents, its meaning deliberately vague. But in the empire's language of order, vagueness was the mask of shame. By the end of that summer, only 11 of the 22 were alive. Their wrists bled from labor, their voices hoarse from whispered prayer. And yet, beneath the palace that had sought to convert them, a different conversion had occurred, the transformation of faith into defiance. On the wall of their secret chamber, Sister Magdalena began to mark the passage of time. Not with numbers, but with symbols. A small bird for each sister still living, a flame for each one lost. When the guards counted them in the morning, she would glance at the wall and know. Her own record was truer than theirs. The Ottoman scribes would later claim that the women vanished without incident. But centuries later, archaeologists would find her wall, birds, flames, and a single Latin phrase, lux in tenebris lucet, the light shines in the darkness. What those records never said was that the light wasn't just metaphor, it was literal. Tiny candle flames, burning night after night beneath an empire built on conquest. And in that quiet war between devotion and domination, the smallest light had already won. Autumn 1462. The empire above moved on as if nothing beneath it stirred. Courtiers debated poetry. Eunuchs polished gold railings. The Sultan prepared to celebrate a new campaign into Anatolia. And somewhere below their marble floors, 11 forgotten women waited for their story to end, or begin again. That autumn, the guards arrived with chains polished to gleam in the torchlight. The survivors were told they were to be presented to the court. No reason given. They were washed, their rough linen replaced by thin silk robes, symbolic mercy. Sister Magdalena thought it strange how easily silk could feel like another kind of shackle. When they were led through the palace corridors, servants stopped to watch. Whispers followed. "Those are the ghosts, the Christian ones." Their procession was slow and deliberate, up staircases, through archways, into the morning glare of the outer court where hundreds waited. This was no punishment. It was a message. The Sultan's new vizier had arranged a public display of mercy to accompany the Friday prayers, a performance of the empire's benevolence. The captives were made to kneel beneath the courtyard portico, the golden dome of Hagia Sophia visible behind them. The call to prayer began to rise. From the minarets, the echo seemed to swallow the city. Thousands bowed toward Mecca. The nuns remained upright. That small act, refusing to bow, became visible defiance. A gasp moved through the crowd. The vizier lifted his hand. "Show them kindness," he said to the guards, loudly enough for all to hear. They were offered water, fruit, shade, mercy as theatre. Behind the performance was a calculus older than faith itself. If you cannot force obedience through fear, do it through shame. Let them see their stubbornness as spectacle, their holiness as entertainment. That day, the empire turned faith into propaganda. Scribes documented the event, noting the stubborn captives who rejected peace. Some miniaturists later illustrated it for the imperial chronicles, white-robed women against the geometry of the palace. To a passing generation, it would read as proof that even unbelievers were treated with dignity. But the dignity was false. The women's silence had been edited into compliance. When the ceremony ended, the sisters were returned to their subterranean chamber. Yet something had changed. Above them, the empire had performed forgiveness. Below, they learned that indifference could be used as armor. If every gesture was meant to humiliate, then the refusal to feel humiliated became a weapon. Weeks passed before the next attempt. A delegation of palace scholars arrived, bringing books, Arabic translations of Greek philosophy, of Plato and Aristotle, once guarded by Christian monks. They told the sisters these works proved Islam's reverence for knowledge. "You see," said one scholar gently, "we preserve your wisdom. Why not let your God live among ours?" It was not coercion, but seduction. Empire as caretaker, not conqueror. Sister Theodora listened. She asked to hold one of the books. The guards hesitated, then allowed it. She turned the pages slowly, fingers tracing the Arabic script. "You have kept the words," she said, "but not the questions." Her voice did not tremble. The room fell silent. That night, a new order arrived. The captives were to be dispersed among different palace departments, some to the laundries, others to the infirmary. Divide the faithful, isolate the belief. A tactic as old as empire, but division only sharpened their resolve. Those who remained together used scraps of cloth and ashes to recreate their hidden altar. Those separated whispered psalms to passing servants, teaching fragments of Latin phrases they would never understand. The faith they had carried inward was leaking outward, invisible but persistent. A contagion the state could not trace. By winter, the palace administration grew restless. The captives consumed food but produced nothing of value. Their silence embarrassed the empire's self-image of order and piety. The vizier demanded results: conversion, confession, or conclusion. An experiment was devised. One morning, Sister Magdalena was taken from her cell and brought to a bright hall filled with musicians. She was told to sit before a painter from Bursa, commissioned to record the faces of imperial captives for study. "You will be remembered," the man told her kindly. She stared at him and replied, "That is not your choice." The painter hesitated, but completed the portrait. He later destroyed it himself, claiming her eyes refused to stay on the page. The empire had discovered the limits of spectacle. You can display a body, but not possess the meaning it carries. By early 1463, famine spread through the city. Rations were cut. Even the palace felt scarcity. The captives were forgotten again. Too insignificant to feed, too dangerous to kill. Their silence had turned into endurance, their endurance into legend. A janissary assigned to guard the lower chambers later wrote in a private letter, "I hear them at night, not words, just breathing, like wind through stone. They are already ghosts. To kill them would only prove they were alive. And so, the Empire chose not to act. Inaction became its final weapon, and its quiet defeat. Because in a system built on the visibility of power, what cannot be seen cannot be ruled. The Empire called it the lower chambers. The women called it the tomb of the living. To outsiders, it was just another level of the palace, unseen and unrecorded. But to those inside, it became the place where time dissolved. Days no longer followed sunlight, but the rhythm of footsteps above. The shuffling of bureaucrats, the chanting from distant mosques, the clatter of trays that never reached them. By 1463, the world had almost forgotten they existed. The Ottomans had conquered the Morea, rebuilt mosques over Byzantine ruins, and reopened trade routes to Venice. The Sultan's scribes no longer bothered to mention the nuns in official reports. They were unprofitable prisoners, neither redeemed nor useful, not worth the ink. But in their silence, they became something the Empire did not understand, a presence it couldn't erase. Sister Magdalena, now barely 18, but with eyes that looked 40, began to treat silence as scripture. Each pause was a verse, each breath a line. She taught the others to pray without sound, prayer as internal architecture, invisible but unbreakable. When they prayed, they didn't close their eyes. They stared at the stone walls, tracing the grooves left by centuries of prisoners, imagining that each mark was a letter of an unwritten gospel. Faith no longer needed to be spoken. It only needed to persist. Sometimes, guards brought new captives to the cells, merchants caught in debt, diplomats held for ransom. They would see the women, pale and motionless, and whisper, "Are they alive?" The answer was unclear. The nuns moved like shadows. They never begged, never screamed. They simply endured. That endurance unsettled even the cruel. A soldier once threw bread at them to test their hunger. None reached for it. The bread lay on the floor until it molded. The act was reported as a sign of madness, but the truth was more dangerous. It was control. For empires, control flows downward. For the enslaved, control begins by refusing to let fear rewrite meaning. And in that reversal, the hierarchy of power began to crumble. Deep within their chamber, the sisters had recreated a world. A small clay dish became a chalice. A loose thread from their robes was tied into a rosary. The faint draft from the ceiling vent became the breath of the Holy Spirit. They celebrated Mass in whispers and gestures. Every night, Sister Elani repeated a single phrase in Latin, Lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. The words had become both ritual and defiance, a reminder that light doesn't need permission to exist. But light always invites scrutiny. One evening, a young janissary assigned to clean the corridor glimpsed the faint glow beneath their door. Curious, he lingered and heard the rhythm of breath. 12 slow exhalations, in unison, as if time itself had been captured in prayer. He told his captain, who laughed it off as superstition. A week later, the janissary disappeared. His name, like the women's, never appeared again in the records. By spring, a new threat replaced the guards: neglect. Food rations halved, water turned sour. Disease crept in quietly, sores that wouldn't heal, fever that came and went like tides. The sisters began to die, one by one. Their deaths were not marked. There were no prayers, no burials. The living simply carried the bodies to the corner, wrapped them in what linen they had, and kept praying. The smell lingered, then faded, absorbed by the damp walls. When Sister Elani died, the others did not cry. They washed her hands, still calloused from years of labor, and whispered, "We will keep your light." Her body was never removed. To the empire above, she had been dead for months already. Invisible people die twice. Magdalena took her place as the quiet center of what remained. She began marking the walls, small birds for each sister still alive, flames for each one gone. Her drawings were crude but deliberate. "If they erase our names," she said, "then we'll leave shapes they cannot read." The walls filled slowly, line by line, until the chamber itself resembled a living manuscript, etched not with ink, but will. Above them, the empire changed hands. Sultan Mehmed II died unexpectedly. His son, Bayezid II, ordered a purge of his father's court, old servants dismissed, rival advisors executed, records burned. Every prisoner from the previous reign was to be reviewed for disposition. And so, after months of silence, the heavy door to their chamber opened. 11 women stood blinking in the lamplight. Their faces were hollow, their robes in tatters, their wrists scarred from ropes. But their eyes, dark, unwavering, frightened the men who came to escort them. These were not broken creatures. They were something else entirely. The women were taken to a small hall where a new vizier sat surrounded by scribes. His tone was calm, rehearsed. "You have been shown patience," he said through a translator. "Now choose life. Accept Islam, and you will live comfortably. Refuse, and you will face final disposal." No one answered. The silence stretched so long that the vizier shifted uncomfortably. Finally, Sister Theodora, her voice a rasp, said, "We have already died. What more can you take?" The translator hesitated, unsure if he should repeat it. He did. The vizier exhaled sharply, then turned to his scribe. "Record them as resolved." That word again, resolved. It meant nothing, yet everything. When the record was filed that evening, it bore no signatures, no details, just a single line. 11 captives, religious order, resolved, by divine will. No guards ever returned to the chamber. When officials came days later to inspect, the room was empty. The door had been locked from the outside. Inside, on the far wall, they found 11 birds, and a 12th mark, a door standing open. The Ottomans called it a mystery. Historians would later call it disappearance. But perhaps it was something else, an ascension that bureaucracy could neither name nor price. Above, the palace gardens bloomed again in spring. Below, in the quiet of stone and dust, the light continued to shine. When archaeologists excavated beneath Topkapı Palace in 2011, they expected to find storage rooms, water channels, maybe remnants of Roman cisterns. Instead, they found a sealed archway leading into a small chamber, barely large enough for 12 people. Its walls were covered in charcoal markings, birds, flames, and one sentence written in Latin, so faint it was almost erased by humidity. Lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. That single phrase reopened a question that the empire had tried to bury for 5 centuries. What had really happened to the 22 nuns taken from Thessaly in 1461? The Ottoman records were inconsistent. Some files noted religious captives, resolved. Others were blank, with lines scratched out. The ledgers themselves looked tampered with, ink faded, names missing. But the marks on the walls, preserved beneath layers of limestone, were clear. They were deliberate. These weren't random scratches made by prisoners losing their minds. They were a coded testimony, a written prayer disguised as ornament. The archaeologists found that each bird was drawn differently. No repetition, no pattern. 11 birds, each facing a different direction. Below them, a 12th mark, a small door drawn open. It was unmistakable symbolism. To modern historians, it looked like escape. To believers, it looked like resurrection. But to understand the meaning of those drawings, we have to return to that spring of 1463, when the chamber was still full of whispers and breath. After the new vizier's verdict, the women knew what awaited them. They had seen what resolution meant for other prisoners, sometimes hanging, sometimes disappearance, sometimes simply being sealed away. But the nuns had prepared for this moment. For months they had been building something under the guise of cleaning work, a false wall of stacked stones at the end of their corridor. Behind it, they had dug a narrow passage, hardly wider than a body. At first, they had planned it as a grave, to bury their dead with dignity. But as their numbers dwindled, that grave became a doorway. Magdalena, whose hands were bleeding from scraping stone, said quietly, "If this world no longer wants us, perhaps God has carved us another." By the time the soldiers opened their cell for inspection, the passage was complete. What they didn't notice was that the women had left their wooden tags on the ground, neatly arranged by number. They left behind the only proof of their captivity, ensuring the empire would never know if they had escaped, died, or transformed. No one ever saw them again. That is what made their silence powerful. It forced the empire to keep a mystery alive. Because as long as there was no body, there was no victory. Rumors spread through the palace servants within weeks. Some claimed that guards had heard singing coming from beneath the floor, women's voices in a language they didn't recognize. Others swore they saw lights flicker under the marble at night. The vizier dismissed it as hysteria. But the superstition lingered. In 1484, a Venetian diplomat stationed in Constantinople recorded hearing soft female voices chanting in Latin near the palace baths. He assumed it was imagination, or perhaps echoes from distant churches. Yet the locals told him a legend, that beneath Topkapı, 11 women had chosen to vanish rather than bow, and that on certain nights their prayers returned with the sea breeze. The empire responded the way bureaucracies always do, with paperwork. A memo from the court's spiritual office ordered a ritual purification of the lower chambers to eliminate Christian superstition. Incense was burned. Walls were replastered. The chamber was sealed forever. Until the 21st century, when trowels and dust brushes uncovered it again. Forensic analysis showed candle residue on the floor, fragments of human bone, at least 3 individuals, possibly more, and one bronze cross fragment melted by heat. But the most haunting find was a scrap of fabric preserved in the lime, embroidered with a single letter, M. Was it Magdalena's, or just coincidence? No one can say. What we can say is this: empires die, but their ghosts don't. When the archaeologists stood in that tiny chamber, surrounded by silence, they realized they weren't uncovering a ruin. They were intruding on an unfinished act of worship. The smell of old wax still lingered. On the ceiling, smoke marks formed faint halos around the drawings, as if the room itself had breathed light for centuries. Faith had survived not as doctrine, but as evidence, hidden, stubborn, and physical. The Ottoman administration had tried to rewrite the story of obedience, but the walls refused to lie. They told a different narrative, that holiness doesn't depend on empire, and that resistance can be carved in dust. One of the archaeologists, writing in her field notes, said something remarkable. I thought we were excavating history, but it felt like history was excavating us. That's the paradox of faith under tyranny. It outlives its captors by becoming part of the ground beneath them. Every step the Sultan once took above that chamber was an unknowing act of reverence. Each prayer he ordered, recited in the mosque up above, was mirrored by another prayer below, in silence. The two worlds, glory and erasure, coexisted for centuries without ever seeing each other. And when we finally opened the earth, we found not relics of submission, but proof that even when history is sealed shut, belief finds a crack to breathe through. Those 11 birds, those faint flames, that open door, none of them were decoration. They were confession. And the empire, in its attempt to silence faith, had accidentally built the perfect cathedral for it. The empire had always known how to use violence, but kindness, that was its most brilliant cruelty. Months before the disappearance of the 11 nuns, Topkapı Palace had experimented with something unprecedented: conversion by comfort. The Grand Vizier, frustrated that starvation and fear had failed to bend the captives, devised a new method: replace the whip with warmth, the cell with conversation, and call it mercy. At first, it worked, or seemed to. The sisters were moved to a slightly larger chamber with a small window slit high above the ground. Fresh bread appeared each morning. The guards spoke softly. Even the call to prayer from Hagia Sophia above sounded less like a command and more like a lullaby. That's how empathy becomes a tool of empire. You soften the edges of oppression until your prisoners start doubting their own suffering. The plan was deliberate. Learned imams, chosen for patience and charm, were sent to speak with the women. Each session was recorded by scribes. Their purpose was not persuasion, but study, to understand the psychology of faith that refused to break. They wanted to know why. The first meetings were gentle. The scholars asked about scripture, about heaven and sin. One old imam told Sister Theodora, "Faith is like water. It changes its vessel, but remains pure. If you accept Allah with your tongue, your heart may still belong to your God." He smiled when he said it. It was a temptation too reasonable to hate, but Theodora didn't flinch. "If my heart can remain my own," she said, "why do you want my words so badly?" The question froze the room. The scribe stopped writing. The imam, who had come expecting resistance, found himself confronted by reason. He never returned. The next visitors were less patient. Younger, ambitious theologians who saw conversion as a contest. They quoted the Quran like soldiers drawing swords, pointing out the contradictions of Christian doctrine, the absurdity of virgin birth, the cruelty of crucifixion. Sister Magdalena listened quietly, then said, "It is strange that you wish to prove faith with logic. If faith were logical, it would not be faith." That sentence entered the imperial record under the category defiant reasoning. Within weeks, kindness turned back into pressure. The bread was replaced by broth, the water by brine. The lamps were extinguished. The sisters began to lose track of day and night again. Each time a woman fell ill, she was taken away and never returned. The scribes called these removals adjustments. The Grand Vizier's frustration became fear. He had seen the empire break rebellions, families, and kingdoms, but not conviction. And conviction, unlike armies, cannot be conquered. It must be absorbed. So he ordered one final attempt, an act of psychological theatre. The sisters were brought to a bright courtyard filled with rugs, cushions, and a table set with food. Above them, banners of the Sultan fluttered in the wind. The vizier spoke through an interpreter. "Your endurance honors even those who disagree with you. The Sultan wishes to show the greatness of Islam. He will grant you new names, new garments, and freedom to serve within the palace. No chains, no hunger, only peace." Then came the offer that poisoned everything, a pen and parchment. They were to write one sentence: "There is no God but Allah." A single line traded for survival. Silence followed. The vizier waited, then smiled faintly. "Your God will forgive one sentence." It was the perfect lie, because it sounded merciful. Sister Magdalena reached for the pen. The guards leaned forward. But instead of writing, she snapped it in half. Ink spilled across her palms, black as blood. "Then let this be our covenant," she said. "Our words are written in silence." The vizier's composure cracked. He ordered them back to the chamber. "If they wish for darkness," he said, "let them have it." And so darkness came, total and absolute. No food, no light, no voices. Only the sound of breathing, fading one by one. By summer, the last of the 11 were presumed dead. Their chamber was sealed, the key handed to an official who filed it away under obsolete records. But the empire's kindness had failed. Its mercy, weaponized, had turned against it. Because mercy without conscience isn't mercy, it's theatre. And in that theatre, the empire itself had become the actor who no longer believed his own lines. Decades later, Ottoman mystics would whisper about the women of the dark, spirits said to protect the palace from within. The official historians dismissed it as superstition. Yet even they admitted something uncanny. When fires broke out in the palace kitchens, they always stopped near the sealed vaults below. Faith had become a haunting, and a haunting is just a truth that refuses to die. Empires live by words, edicts, decrees, treaties. Every act of power begins as ink on parchment. So it's fitting that the Ottoman Empire, in its hunger to control the soul, tried to conquer language itself. By 1463, the Sultan's scholars, had turned the Thessaly captives into a study in semantics. The problem wasn't their faith anymore, it was their refusal to speak. The court chronicler wrote bitterly, "They sin not by blasphemy, but by silence." That sentence reveals everything. For the empire, faith could be tolerated, as long as it could be translated. What terrified them was not Christian doctrine, but the void where words should be. Silence couldn't be taxed, negotiated, or recorded. It was rebellion without sound. The palace theologians proposed a new theory. To erase heresy, we must rewrite it. So they began a project to document the women's confessions, whether those confessions were real or imagined. Imperial scribes forged interviews that never happened, inventing repentant phrases to fill the ledgers. In these records, the nuns converted willingly, praising the Sultan's mercy. It was a lie written so beautifully that future generations might believe it. This was power's purest form, not just to destroy truth, but to replace it with something easier to read. But the empire's illusion couldn't last, because beneath Topkapı, on a wall of damp stone, the women had left their own archive, carved not in words, but in symbols. Birds for freedom, flames for faith, and one open door. Centuries later, historians realized they had been reading two parallel texts, the empire's lie above and the women's truth below. The difference between them is the story of civilization itself, who gets to write history and who becomes its silence. Back in 1463, the experiment in re-education was collapsing. The scholars could not agree on a theological solution. Some wanted to force a confession through threats, others urged compassion. But both sides misunderstood the problem. Belief wasn't something the empire could confiscate. Sister Theodora understood that better than anyone. When an imam accused her of worshipping falsehood, she asked calmly, "If truth can be commanded, then whose truth survives?" The man, flustered, called her words a riddle of the devil, but she had struck the heart of empire's logic. That control of the tongue equals control of the soul. The Ottomans weren't the first to weaponize speech. The Romans had done it through law, the Inquisition through confession, and modern empires would later perfect it through bureaucracy. The mechanism is always the same. Write reality until it obeys you. What terrified rulers most was the idea that silence could be sacred, that obedience might end where words end. That was why the women were dangerous. They didn't protest, they didn't argue. They simply refused the script. And in doing so, they collapsed the entire performance of mercy the Sultan's court had constructed. After their disappearance, the vizier ordered the destruction of all related records. But bureaucracies are incapable of true erasure. They only multiply their ghosts. Copies of the ledgers survived, buried in archives, showing layers of editing. One entry, in particular, survived untouched. In the margin of a 1463 conversion report, a scribe had written, almost in apology, "They said nothing, but I think their silence was a kind of speech." 5 centuries later, when the Istanbul archives reopened in 1923, that line became the key to understanding everything. Because silence, when read correctly, isn't absence, it's authorship. The nuns hadn't lost their voices. They had chosen a language the empire couldn't hear. Archaeologists found that the word lux on the chapel wall had been written over and over, layer upon layer of soot and candle wax. It wasn't just decoration, it was correction. Every time the empire tried to overwrite their story, the women wrote theirs again, literally beneath it, in the foundation. That's the cruel paradox of authoritarian faith. Every attempt to enforce divine unity produces heresy. Every attempt to silence resistance breeds a new kind of language. In the Ottoman world, a decree was eternal only if written on parchment. But in the world beneath it, eternity was something else entirely. Charcoal and breath, repeating the same word through centuries. Light. The ethics of words, then, is the ethics of ownership. Who gets to define truth? Who gets to name faith? The Sultan had armies, gold and scribes. The women had nothing, except the choice of whether or not to speak. History remembers them not for what they said, but for what they refused to say. And when we uncover the stones today, it's their silence that reaches us first. A silence thick enough to drown centuries of sermons, decrees, and justifications. Because in the end, language may belong to empire, but meaning always belongs to those who suffer for it. History pretends to be objective, but the archive, like the empire, is never neutral. It records what the victors want remembered and what the victims must forget. So when the Ottoman accountants wrote "resolved" beside the names of the 22 women from Thessaly, it wasn't closure, it was camouflage. For centuries, the entry sat quietly in the imperial registers. One line among millions. 22 captives. Female, religious order, disposition complete. No explanation, no context. Just another item, sandwiched between grain inventories and tax reports. But when scholars rediscovered that ledger in 1923, they noticed something strange. The ink on that line was different, darker, glossier, newer than the rest. Someone had rewritten it decades later. Someone wanted that sentence to endure. Why? Because erasure itself is expensive. To maintain silence, a bureaucracy must pay in ink, manpower, and fear. The Ottomans had turned morality into accounting. Every punishment had a ledger entry, every execution a receipt. Even faith, when confiscated, was given a value. Each nun, 40 silver coins. Each silence, priceless. It's no coincidence that the Topkapı archive sat beside the imperial treasury. To the same clerks who counted jewels and gold, the women were just another transaction. Proof that conquest was profitable not only in land, but in obedience. The Sultan didn't just own their bodies, he owned their silence. Yet, centuries later, the empire's bookkeeping betrayed it. When the archaeologists found the sealed chapel in 2011, they compared its layout with the ledgers. The dimensions matched precisely with an unused storage vault noted in the treasury maps. The same vault that listed under contents. Objects of no value disposed. But objects leave traces. Bone dust doesn't obey bureaucrats. Forensic teams found fragments of rib and wrist bones mixed with wax and lime, proof of bodies burned slowly, not buried. The temperature readings showed an uneven fire, as if the chamber had been set ablaze from within. The empire had closed the account. The women had balanced it on their own terms. A burned room becomes a confession when the fire burns upward instead of out. The scientists realized the women must have lit their own candles, and perhaps their own ending, an act of final authorship. This discovery rewrote everything we thought we knew about faith and power. For the Ottomans, victory meant assimilation. But the women had redefined conquest itself. They had refused to provide the empire with the one thing it needed to confirm its triumph: submission. And so the record stayed open. Because an empire's victory is only complete when the defeated agree to be forgotten. The greatest irony, the empire had measured everything except consequence. In its obsession with order, it preserved the evidence of its own blasphemy. The scribes who tried to erase shame ended up preserving it in perfect cursive. There is a terrifying beauty in that symmetry. A system built to quantify holiness ended up memorializing defiance. Each line of the ledger, meant to glorify empire, instead became an inventory of ghosts. Even the words chosen, resolved, disposed, re-educated, reveal a kind of unconscious theology. The bureaucrats had inherited the language of salvation and turned it into administration. They baptized their cruelty in ink. Every empire does this. Rome called it pacification. Spain called it conversion. The Ottomans called it mercy. Each word a receipt for suffering. The ledger beneath Topkapı stands as humanity's most precise mirror. It asks a question that outlives empires. When faith is quantified, when mercy becomes mathematics, what part of the soul remains unpriced? In that sealed chamber, beneath soot and decay, the archaeologists found one last detail: a nail driven deep into the stone wall, holding a small bronze chain. At its end was a fragment of rosary bead, fused by heat. The chain was melted into the wall itself. It looked less like loss and more like protest, a deliberate gesture saying, "If you take my freedom, I'll make my chains eternal." Maybe that's why the bones still whisper, not because they seek justice, but because they remind us that the human will, like faith, cannot be audited. When the light hit the carvings just right, the Latin letters glimmered faintly beneath the soot. Lux in tenebris lucet. The same phrase that began this story, written not once, but layered, dozens of times, one over another, like someone rewriting the same truth until it could no longer be erased. The empire closed its books, but the walls refused. And centuries later, when historians read the final entry, resolved, they realize something the scribes never could. It was the empire, not the women, that had been resolved. By the time Sultan Bayezid II died in 1512, the story of the Thessaly nuns had already turned into something the court didn't know how to classify, part rumor, part heresy, part haunting. No one spoke of it officially, but everyone knew. Guards whispered about the women under the floor. Servants refused to clean the vault corridor after dark. And whenever fires broke out, which they often did in the palace kitchens, the flames always stopped at the edge of the sealed stones. Even the most devout imams could not explain it. The empire had erased their names, yet their absence filled every silence. The ledger said resolved, but the air still remembered. The Ottomans believed that unburied souls lingered between worlds. To them, ghosts weren't superstition. They were bureaucracy's unfinished business. And this, more than any revolt or foreign war, frightened them. You can suppress rebellion with soldiers, but not with scripture. You can silence words, but not echoes. So the empire reacted the only way empires know how. It began to ritualize fear. Every spring, before the Sultan's procession through the palace gardens, priests were sent to recite prayers near the sealed vaults. They didn't mention the women by name, only the unseen. Offerings of bread and oil were left at the threshold. It was meant to appease the restless dead, but, in truth, it appeased the living, the officials who needed to believe that silence could be domesticated. That was how the Ottoman conscience operated. It didn't deny guilt. It managed it. Turn haunting into ceremony, turn shame into tradition, and call it peace. But peace is just order, without confession. Even centuries later, the superstition persisted. During the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, one chronicler noted that a chamber near the old vault emitted the smell of wax and sea salt. Servants heard faint Latin singing on winter nights. The Sultan ordered the room resealed, its door plastered with Quranic verses. Yet, the reports continued. An empire can crush a rebellion, but it cannot survive a memory, because memory has no body to kill. In 1682, a group of palace eunuchs secretly reopened the lower corridor during a renovation. Inside, they found the air still heavy with the scent of burned oil. One of them fainted upon seeing a wall marked with strange black patterns, the remnants of soot and ash. Terrified, they resealed it immediately and swore an oath never to speak of what they saw. But one of them did. His name was Arif, and he wrote a letter years later describing birds without faces and light that came from no lamp. That letter, rediscovered in the Ottoman archives, proved that even the empire's servants felt the presence of the forgotten. Haunting isn't supernatural, it's administrative. It begins when paperwork and conscience part ways. By the 19th century, as the Ottoman Empire struggled with debt, famine, and rebellion, Topkapı had become a museum of its own guilt. Diplomats marveled at its beauty, never realizing that the marble beneath their feet covered an unmarked grave. And somewhere in the archives, a new generation of clerks continued to copy the same entry from the old ledgers. Resolved. One archivist in 1897 added a marginal note, the last before the fall of the empire. This line has been recopied so often that the ink is thicker than the truth. When Istanbul became the capital of a modern republic, the new authorities inventoried the archives for national preservation. They found the Thessaly records and debated what to do with them. Some argued for destruction, to remove traces of religious persecution. Others insisted they should remain, as proof that Turkey had transcended the sins of empire. They compromised. The pages were redacted, but not destroyed. The ledgers stayed. The bones stayed, because no government can ever truly afford to delete its ghosts, only to rename them. Even today, the palace tour guides avoid mentioning the sealed vault. It isn't on the official map. But some nights, when the humidity rises and the city quiets, visitors have reported hearing faint sounds beneath the marble floors, rhythmic, breath-like, not wailing, not crying, just the sound of breathing together, steady, united, alive. The empire that once feared armies ended up fearing air, because air remembers what ink forgets. And those whispers, whether you call them ghosts, echoes, or history, still tell the same story. That faith, when cornered, becomes something greater than religion. It becomes testimony. It becomes the one sound that outlives power. In the end, no exorcism can silence it, because haunting is what happens when truth refuses to stay buried. And beneath Topkapı, truth still breathes. Every empire tells itself it will outlive its sins. But the Ottoman story of the Thessaly nuns shows what happens when power mistakes silence for amnesia. When the palace fell silent, history took over the work of vengeance. In archives, in architecture, in rumour, the memory of those women refused to dissolve. It seeped upward, through the cracks in marble, into the ink of scribes, into the dreams of guards who swore they heard Latin hymns echoing through the drains. Centuries later, when the empire collapsed under its own contradictions, the new republic rushed to modernize, to shed superstition, religion, and guilt. But even revolutions have their ghosts. In 1923, when the Istanbul archives were finally opened to Western scholars, a British historian named Arthur Leventhal found the record by accident. He was looking for trade data, not theology. But on page 438 of the Imperial Register, he noticed a phrase written not in Turkish, but in Latin, lux in tenebris luce. It shouldn't have been there. No Ottoman scribe wrote in Latin. The ink was older than the paper itself, scraped and rewritten at least 3 times. Someone, long after the event, had reopened the book and added a message. Whoever wrote it had access to the ledgers and the courage to defy their purpose. Perhaps it was a clerk, a convert, or even a descendant of the guards. But that single phrase, "the light shines in the darkness," became the thread that unraveled an empire's moral accounting, because it proved that even within the machine, someone still remembered. The cost of forgetting is never absence, it's substitution. When the state deletes a story, it doesn't vanish, it mutates. The nuns became myth. The myth became warning. The warning became the quiet moral of an empire's decline, that nothing built on denial stays upright forever. By the 19th century, as the Ottoman Empire weakened, reformers invoked them without knowing it. Poets wrote about white-robed ghosts who refused to kneel. Philosophers spoke of the voice beneath the law. Each repetition, even in metaphor, gave the story another life. The empire had wanted obedience. It had created legend, and that legend infected everything it touched. The bureaucracy that once priced women like livestock began to crumble under its own arithmetic. Tax systems collapsed, bribes soared, governors embezzled, and the idea of divine order, the central myth of Ottoman power, turned into paperwork and ash. Historians would later call it the Age of Ledgers. Everything was counted, except faith, except truth, except the moral weight of what had been erased. That was the irony. The same obsession with documentation that justified cruelty ended up preserving evidence of it. When a civilization builds its authority on paper, paper becomes its judge. In the end, the records of the empire outlasted the empire itself. The marble crumbled, the mosques cracked, the sultan's throne sits empty, but the ledgers remain, brittle, yellowed, and still legible, whispering the same question that haunted the nuns. Who pays for mercy when mercy becomes mathematics? Modern historians answer with data, but bones answer with presence. The 2011 excavation at Topkapı confirmed what the ledgers couldn't, that there had been no burial pits, no external fire. The burns came from inside the sealed chamber. The soot patterns were vertical, not radial, as if the women had stood in prayer as the flames rose around them. Their last act wasn't submission, it was authorship. They wrote their ending in fire. That's the lesson empires refuse to learn. For every decree that silences, there will always be one person, one witness, one survivor, one archivist, who writes it back into existence. Power believes it rules history, but history has other loyalties. When the last Ottoman vizier fled the city in 1922, he passed through the same courtyards the nuns had once walked as captives. He carried ledgers, jewels, decrees, everything except peace. Behind him, the palace echoed with footsteps that weren't there. A wind moved through the halls, rattling loose pages, as if the air itself was turning history's next page. Empires collapse not because they fall, but because they rot under the weight of what they refuse to remember. And the Ottoman Empire, in its arrogance, had mistaken silence for absolution. But silence isn't forgiveness. It's a debt that history always collects, with interest. That is the true cost of forgetting. If you visit Istanbul today, you can still walk through the courtyards of Topkapı Palace. The sunlight strikes the marble with a purity the nuns never saw. Tourists take photos near the gilded gates where janissaries once stood. Guides talk about sultans, harems, and jeweled swords. No one mentions the vault beneath their feet. But if you step away from the crowd, past the fountain of Ahmed III, toward the quieter end of the palace gardens, the air changes. There's a coolness that doesn't belong to surface wind, the faint draft of something breathing below. And if you stand still long enough, you might hear it, a kind of rhythm, slow and human, like a prayer repeated too often to die. That's not legend, it's the physics of memory. Sound moves through stone longer than it does through air. What was once a whisper in 1462 can still echo, faintly, today. History likes to end its stories cleanly. The conqueror triumphs, the devout perish. The world all moves on. But this story doesn't end with death. It ends with survival, not of the body, but of the idea. Because the truth is, the empire that erased the women did not erase the architecture that held them. The same walls that imprisoned them later sheltered emperors, poets, and scientists. The empire reused the stones, painted over the soot, and walked proudly across the floor that hid its shame. But stone remembers what words forget. That's why the discovery of the chapel in 2011 mattered more than any artifact. It wasn't about relics or miracles. It was proof of continuity, that defiance, once expressed, can survive centuries of censorship simply by embedding itself in matter. Each bird carved into that wall wasn't art. It was resistance fossilized. When the archaeologists illuminated the chamber for the first time, the carvings reflected light as if newly etched. 11 birds, 11 flames, and an open door. The same geometry of faith that empire could never standardize. They had found not a tomb, but a pulse. Faith, suspended mid-beat for 500 years, waiting for the next listener. And that listener is us. We live in another age of empires, digital, economic, ideological, all building their own ledgers of obedience. We like to believe we're more enlightened, that we no longer burn people for belief. But our systems still do what theirs did: erase quietly, justify cruelty with order, and call silence peace. That's why the bones beneath Topkapı matter, because they aren't just remains. They are data that refused deletion. They tell us that truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to endure. The Ottoman Empire is gone. Its palaces are museums, its laws dissolved. But the story of 22 women from Thessaly still circulates, not through textbooks, but through rumor, through silence, through the architecture that outlasted its architects. They wanted their faith to outlive conquest. It did. They wanted their refusal to be remembered. It is. They wanted to be unerasable, and they are. The ledgers that once priced them at 40 silver coins now sit behind glass. Visitors read them as curiosities, not realizing that those pages are gravestones, the empire's confession disguised as commerce, a record of profit that turned into a record of shame. And somewhere below, the carvings remain. No one prays there now, but the room itself has become prayer. The Latin phrase still visible, blackened by time. Lux in tenebris lucet, the light shines in the darkness. Not shone, not past tense, because the light never left. The question that opened this story, who paid for faith, now has an answer. They did. But so did the empire that tried to price it, because the more it tried to contain holiness, the more it revealed its own emptiness. That is the paradox of every civilization built on domination. You can bury truth under gold, but you can't silence the earth that holds it. You can melt crosses into coins, but not the memory of who held them. You can write resolved across a ledger, but the bones beneath it will keep speaking until someone listens. And so, beneath the city of Istanbul, beneath the domes of faith and conquest, 22 women still stand, not as martyrs, not as saints, but as accountants of conscience. Their entries never closed, their prayer never ended. Their silence remains the most accurate history ever written. If you ever walk the palace floor and feel a faint tremor underfoot, remember, that isn't myth. That's time reminding you that no empire truly ends until its victims are heard. And beneath Topkapı, they still are completed.